There is a kind of silence that does not comfort, a silence that does not arrive after the noise has ended, but rather precedes it, as though the world has drawn a breath it never intends to release. It was into this silence that he walked in the autumn of 1900, a man whose name the records have mostly forgotten, a traveler moving through the interior of a continent that had not yet fully decided what it wanted to be. America, at the turning of that century, was a place of tremendous becoming. Cities were swelling. Rails were threading themselves across ancient prairies. Men were talking about progress the way other men talked about God, with absolute conviction and no real understanding of what they were invoking. And yet, beyond the cities, beyond the depots and the telegraph lines and the surveyors' stakes, there remained enormous territories that had simply declined to participate in all of that becoming. Wild country. Honest country, in its way. Country that had no interest in your ambitions or your century. He had started from a small rail town in the northwest, a place of mud streets and men with hard eyes, and women who did not look up when strangers passed. He had provisions for perhaps 2 weeks. He had a wool coat that had once belonged to someone taller. He had a compass that pointed consistently a few degrees east of true north, which is to say he had a compass that lied to him in small, manageable increments. He had a journal, half filled already with observations about weather and terrain and the particular quality of light in places where civilization had not yet thought to put a lamp. He was not, by any conventional definition, a dangerous man. He was not, by any conventional definition, a particularly brave one either. He was simply a man who walked, and who found in the walking something that other men sought in liquor, or religion, or the company of women. A temporary erasure of the self, a forgetting that felt almost like peace. He moved through pine forests that rose around him like the pillars of a cathedral dedicated to some creed he could not name. The ground was soft with decades of fallen needles, and his footsteps made almost no sound, which pleased him. He liked the idea of moving through the world without disturbing it. He liked the idea that the forest might not notice him, that the trees might continue their long, slow conversation about light and soil and the passage of seasons without interruption on his account. He crossed streams that ran so cold they hurt to touch. He climbed ridge lines and looked out over valleys filled with mist in the early mornings, valleys that looked like the sketches of valleys rather than the real things, soft and indistinct and somehow preliminary, as though the world were still working out the details. For the first several days, he felt the particular joy that belongs to solitude chosen freely. This is a joy that most people never taste, because most people who find themselves alone have not chosen it. It has been chosen for them by circumstance or loss, or the slow erosion of connection that time performs on all things. But he had chosen it, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what he was entering. And so for those first days the wilderness received him like a gift he had given himself. He slept deeply. He woke easily. He noted in his journal the behavior of birds, the direction of prevailing winds, the way certain mosses clung to the north-facing sides of stones, as though they understood something about navigation that human beings had only recently managed to formalize. It was on the 6th day that things began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. He could not have said at first what changed. The forest looked the same. The sky offered the same gray October light it had been offering all week, a light without shadows, flat and even and somehow more revealing than direct sunlight for precisely that reason. You could see everything, but nothing had depth. He noted in his journal that he felt slightly off, that there was a quality to the air that afternoon he could not quite characterize. He wrote the word anticipatory, and then crossed it out, and wrote instead suspended, and then crossed that out as well, and left the page half empty, which was unlike him. He was a man who liked to fill pages. He had been walking for several hours when he smelled it. Wood smoke. Not the wild, dispersed smell of a distant fire, but the close, domestic smell of a fire tended, a fire fed, a fire that meant a hearth and a chimney, and the presence of human habitation. He stopped walking and stood very still, the way one does when a sound or a smell is so unexpected that the body wants a moment to confirm it before the mind commits to a response. Yes, there it was, wood smoke, and beneath it, something else, something cooked, though he could not say what. Something that occupied the border between appealing and unsettling, that occupied the place where hunger and discomfort briefly share the same address. He followed the smell through a stand of old-growth fir, trees so large around that 3 men with linked arms could not have encircled them. Trees whose lowest branches were 30 feet above the forest floor, so that walking among them was like walking through a space that had been deliberately cleared and arranged, like walking through architecture. And then the trees thinned, and he saw it. A hut. Though that word perhaps flatters the structure slightly. It was something assembled from the forest itself. Rough-cut timber and stripped bark and a roof of overlapping wooden shingles that had warped and greened with moisture until they resembled nothing so much as scales on some enormous, flattened creature. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, and the clearing itself was strange, because the trees around it did not thin in the organic, gradual way that clearings usually happen in old forests. They stopped. They simply stopped, as though they had been instructed to go no further, as though some agreement had been reached between the structure and the wood that neither party wished to revisit. There was a window, a single window, small and set asymmetrically in the front wall, covered not with glass, but with what appeared to be a stretched membrane, some translucent animal skin that filtered the interior light into a color that had no clean name. Amber, perhaps, or the color of old teeth. Smoke rose from a central chimney in a column that went straight up, perfectly vertical, without bending or dispersing, as though even the wind had decided it wanted nothing to do with this place. He stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, long enough that the light began to change, long enough that the idea of setting up his own camp before dark became less and less plausible. He told himself he was being sensible. He told himself that any reasonable traveler, encountering habitation after nearly a week in empty wilderness, would approach and introduce himself, and inquire after shelter and perhaps a meal. He told himself all of this in the particular internal voice we use when we are preparing to do something our instincts have already vetoed. He knocked on the door. It was a low door, lower than doors typically are, and it was made of planks that did not quite fit flush, so that thin lines of interior light escaped around the edges, that same amber, tooth-colored light from the window membrane. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then the door opened, and he saw the family for the first time. The man who opened the door was tall and very thin in the manner of structures that are thin, not slender but reduced, as though something had been removed from him gradually over a long period of time, not all at once. His face was long, and his eyes were set deep, and they were pale, not the blue or gray that pale eyes typically are, but a color closer to the color of water over stone, a color that suggested transparency rather than pigment. He wore clothes that had once been good clothes, a vest, a collarless shirt, but that had been worn and reworn until they had achieved a texture closer to skin than fabric. He looked at the traveler with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile. He looked at him the way you look at a thing you have been expecting and were not certain you wanted to arrive. Behind the tall man, visible in the amber interior, were the others, a woman seated at a table, 2 children standing near the far wall. Or, and this is where the traveler's journal entries, which he wrote later that night and in the days that followed, become difficult to parse cleanly, or what appeared to be a woman and 2 children. He would write that word repeatedly, appeared. He was a careful writer, a man attentive to the difference between what he observed and what he concluded, and so he used that word deliberately, and its presence on those pages, repeated and underlined, is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the documents that survive. The tall man said, "Come in," and he went in. The interior of the hut was larger than its exterior suggested, and this impossibility lodged itself in a back corner of his mind like a splinter, noticed but not dealt with, pressed down to be returned to later. The ceiling was low, crossed with dark beams from which things hung. Dried herbs and braided grasses and other objects less easily identified, shapes wrapped in what might have been cloth, or might have been something else, pendulous and swaying slightly despite the absence of any apparent draft. The floor was packed earth, covered in places by animal hides, and the hides were arranged in a pattern that he found himself studying without meaning to, a pattern that seemed almost to resolve into something recognizable and then declined, at the last moment, to do so. The woman at the table did not look up when he entered. She was engaged in some form of handwork, moving her fingers in a rhythmic, repetitive motion over something in her lap that he could not see. Her hair was dark and hung loose around her face, and her face itself, on the occasions when he glimpsed it, was not an unpleasant face, but was a face from which all expression had been removed as efficiently as furniture is removed from a house before its sale. It was a face that was waiting. He did not know what for. The two children were standing against the far wall, with their arms at their sides, in the attitude of people waiting to be told what to do. They were a boy and a girl, or appeared to be. They were pale, the way all the members of this family were pale. Pale in a way that spoke not of indoor living, but of something more fundamental, as though the quality of light they typically inhabited was simply insufficient for the production of color. They watched him with eyes that were serious and still, and they did not speak, and they did not fidget. And he had spent enough time around children to know that children of their apparent age, perhaps 7 and 9, do not typically stand still and quiet in the presence of a stranger unless they have been very specifically taught that the arrival of strangers requires this behavior. And that teaching, whatever form it had taken, troubled him in ways he could not immediately articulate. They gave him food. He would spend a great deal of time in his journal trying to describe what the food was, and he would consistently fail. It was something in a bowl, something dark and thick, and it tasted of the forest, not unpleasantly, but completely, as though whoever had prepared it had been attempting to concentrate the essential flavor of the surrounding wilderness into a single, consumable form. He ate because he was hungry, and because refusing would have required an explanation he did not have. The tall man sat across from him and watched him eat. The woman continued her handwork. The children did not eat. Conversation happened, or something that occupied the shape of conversation. The tall man spoke in complete sentences and responded to questions with what were technically answers, and yet the cumulative effect of the exchange was a profound deepening of incomprehension. When the traveler asked how long they had lived here, the tall man said, "Long enough." When the traveler asked where they had come from, the tall man said, "The same as you," and smiled for the first time. A smile that arrived on his face like a visitor arriving at the wrong house, present, but clearly mistaken about something. When the traveler asked what they lived on, the tall man gestured at the hanging shapes above and said what the forest provides. He slept that night on a pallet near the hearth. This had been offered without being requested, and he had accepted without quite intending to. Later, he would struggle to reconstruct exactly how this had been arranged, who had said what, at what point in the evening the decision had been made. It seemed to him, in retrospect, that the arrangement had simply materialized, that at some point during the evening the possibility of leaving had been quietly removed from the available options, without any overt act of prevention. The door had not been locked. No one had told him he must stay. He had simply found, at some point in the darkening evening, that leaving had stopped feeling like a thing he was going to do. He woke in the deepest part of the night to find the children standing near his pallet, looking at him. They were not touching him. They were simply standing there in the dark, and he could see them because the fire had burned down to coals that gave just enough light to see by. And in that light, the children's faces were the color of the coals themselves, faintly illuminated, and their eyes caught the light in a way that eyes typically do not, with a reflectivity that suggested something structural about the eyes themselves that he did not want to examine too carefully. He said nothing. They said nothing. After a time that he could not measure, he closed his eyes again, and when he opened them, they were gone. In the morning, the family behaved as though the night had been completely uneventful, and because he could find no way to raise the subject of standing children in firelight without it sounding like an accusation, he said nothing, and the morning proceeded with its ordinary surface intact. He should have left that morning. His journal makes it clear that he knew he should leave. He wrote the words, "I should go." And then he wrote, "I will go after breakfast." And then he wrote, "The sun is past midday, and the light is changing, and there is no particular reason to leave before tomorrow." And then he stopped writing for several hours. When he resumed, his handwriting had changed slightly, had become smaller and more compressed, as though the words were contracting against some external pressure. The second night, he heard sounds from behind the wall beside which the children slept, sounds that began as something he might have identified as speech, and then moved incrementally into a range that speech does not occupy. Something rhythmic and low, something that seemed to be in conversation with itself, a sound that called and answered and called again in patterns that repeated but did not quite identically repeat, patterns that evolved in the way that certain natural processes evolve, the way water erodes stone, the way erosion follows the path of least resistance, the way the path, once established, deepens. He lay in the dark and listened, and did not move, because there was something about the sound that made him feel that movement would be noticed, that movement would constitute a form of participation he was not prepared to offer. By the third day, he had stopped consulting his compass. He could not have explained why. It was in his coat pocket. He could feel its weight. He simply did not reach for it. He felt, in a way he could neither justify nor dismiss, that knowing direction had become somehow irrelevant, that the question of which way was north was a question belonging to a different order of existence than the one he currently occupied. He helped the tall man with some repairs to the structure's outer wall, and as he worked, he observed that the boards they were using were not from any tree he could identify, not pine, not fir, not cedar, not any of the species he had spent the previous week walking through. They were from something darker and finer grained, and when the saw cut through them, they produced a smell that was not the smell of cut wood. He did not ask about it. The woman spoke to him for the first time on the afternoon of the third day. She came and stood beside him while he was sitting outside watching the clearing's impossible wall of trees, and she said, without preamble, "You are noticing things." He said he supposed he was. She said that was natural, at first. He asked her what she meant by "at first." She went back inside without answering, and through the amber window membrane he could see her resume her position at the table, resume the handwork, resume the rhythmic motion of fingers over something unseen. And she did not look out at him. And yet he had the absolute, unreasonable, unshakable conviction that she was watching him with perfect attention, that the absence of her gaze was itself a form of watching, that he was being observed by the negative space where observation was not occurring. He tried to write that night and found that his hand would not cooperate. Not that it trembled or cramped, but that it produced letters that were not quite the letters he intended, that his written words kept veering toward words he had not chosen, that reading back what he had written was like reading the work of a man who was sharing his handwriting but not his mind. He put the journal away. He lay on the pallet. Above him, the shapes hanging from the beams moved in rhythms that did not correspond to any movement of air he could detect. And he watched them, and he thought about what they contained. And he found that he could not sustain the thought, that each time he approached the conclusion of that particular line of reasoning, his mind offered him something else to consider, something more comfortable, something with a familiar shape, until the conclusion receded and he was left with the comfortable thing, warm and vague and slightly nauseating. On the fourth morning, he noticed his reflection. There was no mirror in the hut, but there was water in a basin near the hearth, and he was washing his face, and he looked down into the basin, and the face that looked back at him was his face, recognizably his face, and yet it had been altered in some way that he could not immediately specify. He looked at it for a long time, cataloging features, nose and eyes and the line of the jaw, all present and in their correct relative positions, and yet the face was wrong in some aggregate sense, wrong in the way that a sentence is wrong when all its words are individually correct, but their arrangement produces a meaning the author did not intend. He dried his face on the cloth provided and did not look into the basin again. The children had begun to speak to him, not much, and not about anything that could later be deemed significant, but small observations offered in voices that were more uniform in pitch and cadence than children's voices typically are, as though the variability that living produces in the human voice had been carefully edited out. They told him the names of things in the forest around the hut, names he had not heard before, and which bore no relationship to any taxonomy or common nomenclature he knew. They pointed at specific trees and said their names. They pointed at marks on the tree line and explained what the marks signified without explaining what system of significance they were drawing on. And he listened, and he found that the names were beginning to stick in his memory with a tenacity that ordinary new words do not have, that he could not release them once received, that they sat in his mind with a weight and permanence that suggested they were not new words at all, but very old ones, words he was not learning but remembering. He did not know what day it was. He had stopped marking his journal with dates 2 days previously, and he could not now reconstruct the count from the entries themselves, because the entries had become less reliable, less sequential, less like documentation and more like attempts to describe something that was happening to description itself. He knew he had been there 4 days, or 5, or possibly 6. He knew the forest outside the clearing was still there because he could hear it. He did not go into it. He did not think about why he did not go into it. He thought about the names the children had given to things, and he thought about the pattern on the animal hides, and he thought about the shape of the tall man's smile, and he thought about what the woman's hands were doing when they moved over the unseen thing in her lap, and he thought about the sounds from behind the wall at night, and all of these things assembled themselves in his mind into something that almost had a form, and then the form dissolved, and he sat by the hearth and watched the fire, and the fire watched him back with its one constantly rearranging eye. There was a night, he cannot say which night, his journal cannot say, when he woke to find not the children but the woman kneeling beside his pallet. She was close enough that he could see her face in detail for the first time, and her face was not the face of a woman who had had expressions removed from it. Her face was the face of a woman who had moved beyond the need for expression, who communicated in registers that expressions had not evolved to represent. She was looking at him with something that he identified, absurdly, as concern. She said to him, in a voice that was barely separated from silence, "You are going to need to decide." He said, "Decide what?" She said, "Whether you are a visitor or a resident." He said, "I am a traveler passing through." She looked at him for a moment in a way that made him feel that this statement had revealed something about him that he had not intended to reveal, and then she stood and went away. And in the morning, when he asked her what she had meant, she was again the woman who did not look up, the woman whose face was waiting. He found the bones on the 5th day, or the 6th. He found them behind the hut, in a place where the structure met the tree line at one of its impossible straight-stopped angles. They were arranged, not scattered. Arranged in a configuration that rhymed with the pattern on the hides inside, the same pattern that kept almost resolving into recognition. They were the bones of animals, he told himself. He told himself this with the force and repetition of a man telling himself something he does not believe. Animal bones. The forest is full of animals. The forest is full of things that die. He went back inside and sat near the hearth, and the tall man brought him tea, a tea that tasted of those same unnamed things the forest was full of, and he drank it, and the warmth of it spread through him with a thoroughness and a speed that warmth does not typically achieve, reaching places in his body that warmth usually does not reach, filling angles and corners and the spaces between thoughts, and he felt, briefly but completely, that everything was perfectly in order. His journal from the following days contains entries that are difficult to characterize as either lucid or delusional, because they have the internal consistency of lucidity and the content of delusion, which is the most disorienting combination available. He writes about the family with what he calls increasing clarity. He writes that he has begun to understand the woman's handwork, that it is a form of record-keeping, that the thing in her lap is a kind of text, that she is inscribing something into a medium that she did not create but inherited, that the inscription is ongoing, and possibly has been ongoing for longer than he can calculate. He writes that the children's names for things in the forest are correct, that they correspond to something real, that the taxonomy he arrived with is the fiction, and theirs is the map of actual territory. He writes that the tall man has explained to him the nature of the clearing, that the trees stopped where they did because this is where the forest ends, not in space, but in kind, that beyond the clearing's edge, the forest is a different thing than what it appears to be from inside the clearing. He writes, "I think I have misunderstood the direction of the boundary." He writes, in an entry undated and written in handwriting that is his, but stretched somehow, elongated, as though his hand is reaching for something beyond the page. "The mirror in the basin showed me something today that was not wrong. That was the frightening thing. It showed me something that was not wrong. It showed me what is here, and what is here is what I am. And I do not know when that became the case, or whether it was always the case, and this place has simply made it visible. Somewhere in the archive of things we do not discuss, there exists the question of what happens to a mind that is not broken, but is opened. Opened the way a room is opened when a wall is removed, suddenly possessed of a perspective it was not designed to manage, suddenly in relationship with a space it has no furniture for. He was not a man who had gone mad in the recognizable, violent way that madness is typically represented. He was a man whose mind had been systematically, carefully, over a period of days, introduced to a framework that his prior education had left him entirely unequipped to refuse. He did not go mad. He was translated. Into what, the journal does not finally say. The last entry is short. It says only, "They have asked me, and I have answered. And the answer surprised me, but I find I mean it. And the door is where it has always been. And I am still here. And the morning is coming through the membrane window in that amber light, and the children are awake, and the woman is at the table, and the tall man is standing in the doorway looking out at the clearing with his hands at his sides. And from here, from this angle, in this light, he is the most familiar thing I have ever seen, and I do not know what that means, and I have stopped needing to." He was never reported missing. There was no one to report him. He was a man who had chosen solitude so thoroughly that his absence registered nowhere. Not in ledgers, not in letters, not in the minds of people who might have noted a gap where he had been. The rail town he had started from did not notice that he had not returned because it had not noticed, particularly, that he had been there. The wilderness he walked into is still there, in a technical sense. The coordinates exist. The territory can be located on maps. The particular arrangement of fir and pine and cold stream and ridge line above Misty Valley still persists. But the clearing, if you look for it, if you go to where it should be based on what extrapolation from his journal's early entries makes possible, the clearing is not there. The trees do not stop. The forest continues in all directions with perfect, uninterrupted organic consistency. There is no structure. There is no amber light. There is no smoke rising in a vertical column above a chimney. There is only the forest, making its long, slow argument about what it means to be ancient, about what it means to persist beyond the civilizations that periodically decide to move through you and claim you and name you and make maps of you that do not correspond to anything you actually are. The forest, which was here before the century turned and will be here when the next several centuries have turned after it, and which contains, in its dark interior, in the spaces between its oldest trees, in the patterns made by root and branch, and the particular silence that lives just below the range of human hearing, things that have no names in any language currently spoken, and things that have names in languages that were spoken once, briefly, by people who went into the wilderness and did not come back in any form that the world that sent them out would have recognized or known what to do with. There is a kind of silence that does not comfort, a silence that does not arrive after the noise has ended, but rather waits, patient and enormous and completely indifferent to your arrival, in the places where the world has not yet finished becoming whatever it is in the slow process of becoming. He walked into that silence once, in the autumn of 1900, with his lying compass and his half-filled journal and his wool coat that had once belonged to someone taller. And the silence received him, as it receives everything that enters it, completely and without remainder, the way the forest floor receives what falls, with patience, with darkness, with the long chemistry of transformation, and with no particular interest in what the thing had been before it arrived.